Hello to all my fellow cat lovers out there. This episode is dedicated especially to you. Today I'm revealing just how I drew this 12 by 16 inch portrait of Willow. And I'll be back at the end of the speed drawing you're about to watch, and I'll explain a few of my methods. I start with the ear and begin by laying down those really dark values. This helps me judge the subsequent values because I have a frame of reference, and it also helps keep me on track when looking at the original photo and my drawing. I'm creating a base layer so that I can easily lay on the top layers with those softer carbothello pencils. Those will create nice fine lines that glide over easily. It seems that those softer pencils are generally more opaque and thus are ideal for superficial layers where you're adding stark pops of color. The next step is to block in areas of dark color on that left upper quadrant of her face. I'm doing this with blacks, umbers, browns, grays. And what I'm doing is, again, creating that base layer where I'm blending it oftentimes with my fingers to really drive it into the tooth of the paper. This just makes those top layers go on effortlessly. And I'm using that light yellow to add those finer strands. Really, you want to focus on those transition zones where the light meets the dark. I do that with often some medium gray colors, and you really want to have a gradation there, not just a blunt end where the light and dark meet. I use a wide variety of pastel pencil brands, basically because each brand has different utility for me. The Faber-Castell PastelMat set that I have is really great for those base layers. It's a harder pencil, whereas the softer brands like Caran d'Ache and Carbothello are really awesome for those superficial layers, as I mentioned before. The Caran d'Ache white has been the most opaque white that I can find, but I do use it sparingly. With the eye, I like to start by outlining the pupil, the medial canthus, the lateral canthus, basically just the whole periphery of that eye with those very dark values. I then go and add some medium grays, some warm grays, cool grays, a lot of grays, and I really make sure I punch those white highlights. I want those to stay as white as possible. Her eyes are very dilated in this low-lit photo, so we don't get to see a lot of her iris, which is a darker green, but I did try to incorporate a few punches of green in there just to show her off a bit. I then proceed to the left lower quadrant of her face, probably my least favorite part on any animal. I'm blocking in the dark values, especially around her mouth and the left side of her face there, just trying to, again, allow myself to have a frame of reference. Looking back and forth between the photo and the drawing, it's very taxing on the eyes, so I try to create landmarks for myself and take it bit by bit, strand by strand. You can see I add the left side of that shelf that she's sitting on. It kind of cuts off strangely, but I will address that later. Again, I go in and touch up areas where it seems to have an unnatural transition zone. I use a lot of those light warm grays to add areas where the light is reflecting. I don't want her to get too predominated with the dark colors, the blacks, the umbers, and the very lights. I want also those pops of brown that characterize her calico nature. So we're adding some kind of tan, sandy colors, little earthy tones, just anything to add a little bit more dimension, because she does have a few strands of brown in there. They're just harder to see. We don't want them to get overpowered. A little side note about areas where you have really dark values meeting the very light values. For instance, around the mouth there where I have those dark areas where her whiskers would kind of branch out from and they're meeting those white layers. Sometimes those regions can become very muddied because the pencil is dragging the color across those zones. So sometimes you may want to clean off your pencil in between each stroke just so that you can keep the colors clean and more pure. So that's what I do from time to time. I then work my way up the bridge of her nose, her forehead. This is a very tricky area as far as the orientation of hairs. You want to make sure that you have those directional strands correct. Working my way to that top right quadrant and up in that right ear. Again, dark values down first. Kind of blend with your fingers if you have to really rub that color into the paper. And then follow it up with your lighter colored pencils. This side of her face is more in the shadows, so it's a bit darker. I still try to add some dimension though, with some grays and dark browns, just so that it's not just a big blob, a big mass of black. Moving on to that other eye, we have even less green showing in this eye because it is in the shadows again, but I'm still filling in those very dark values with that Pitt Pastel black pencil. Works pretty well. There's a little bit of blue in those reflections. It's nice to add those pops of different color. Then I'm going and adding anything on the top that I don't want to drag my hand across, so in this case, the back of the shelf. And while I should have done this at the beginning, I decided mid-portrait to tape it down with painter's tape around the border, just to protect the edges while I incorporate a background, inevitably. I then go around the border of her face, I'm adding those dark values, just kind of road mapping, a little bit all over the place. With the nose, she kind of had a funny spotted nose. I couldn't quite figure out where it began and ended, but some grays and pinks in there. This right side is so much easier, so much nicer. It's more of natural direction for my hand to flow. And then further defining those areas underneath her eyes with that black pencil. Proceeding over to the bottom left of the shelf, trying to get those wood-grained patterns incorporated. The light is coming from that left side, so that's why there's some highlights on that left border. This may seem obvious, but you always want to make sure that you have the background laid down before putting any strands of hair over top of it. So blending in those wooden shelves here is really important, and then I can add her fur stretching over it. Going over the mouth region, trying to layer in those dark colors over the lights. It got kind of tricky, so I go over them a few times. I proceed to her bib area. I'm basically just touching up wherever I can see that there are deficits. Finishing that left side of the shelf that I incorporated from different photos. And what's nice about the body is that that right side is more in the shadows, so it can be a little bit looser. After we get done with that other paw, we're able to go down to the wooden railings and really just incorporate probably every brown I own. I determined that I wanted the background to be lighter than it was in the reference photo, just so we could see her pop out against that background better. So to create a gradation, I use my dark pencils in between those spindles there, and then on that left side, and then use my PanPastels to kind of blend into a gradient on the top. And then finally touch up with the fine hairs and whiskers. All done! Willow's owner was actually kind enough to send me this footage of Willow watching herself being drawn. Is it just me, or does she look a little skeptical? Alright, welcome back. Just a few comments on Willow here. First and foremost, I think it's worth declaring that Willow is a 16-year-old cat. I made the mistake of Googling cat years and went down that rabbit hole, but it said that the first 2 years of a cat's life are the equivalent of a human's first 25 years. And then every year after that is the equivalent of 4 human years. So, to do the math, 16-year-old Willow is really 81-year-old Willow in cat years. Should we give her an applause for that? Knowing that, I lovingly referred to her as Grandmother Willow throughout this drawing process. I usually like to start out by talking a bit about the reference photo because they are so pivotal in the drawing process. This reference photo was pretty good. I could see a lot of the detail. It had some interesting lighting, which can add some dimension to the portrait. This picture, 12 by 16 inches, makes Willow larger than life. Actually larger than life. So her head is not actually the size of a cantaloupe. A cantaloupe, I'm not sure. Whatever that size would be, but it's not that big in real life. She's much smaller. So it's especially important for these larger compositions that you have an ideal reference photo where you're able to see each individual hair because you're going to have to draw each individual hair. With this portrait, I didn't know at first if I would be leaving the background as is or just the color of the paper or if I would be filling it in a darker color. So I did not start out by drawing that background. Normally it's best to fill in your background so that you can put the subject over top of that color. It really helps with these transition zones between where the subject is and the background meet because sometimes you're working around that and it makes it seem a little bit like it's not able to blend. But you work around that later on if you have to. It just makes it trickier. Sometimes it's difficult for me to transition into cat drawing mode. After drawing so many dogs over and over and over, you'll see that cats are quite a bit different, and it's very much so in the way that their fur lays, the layering of it, the length of each hair, and each hair can have just gradations of color. Willow, God bless her, but she has a ton of different colors in that coat of hers. So I start out very slow, and I started from left to right, top to bottom. And as a righty, as a right-handed person, that works best for me because I'm not smearing what I'm already drawing. So if I started over here, I'd be smudging what I already placed down on the paper. And that's the opposite for you if you're left-handed. I'm telling you what, you guys, this left side is so difficult because as a right-handed person, the way those strokes are oriented, it's difficult and unnatural for my hand to be placing the pencil in that direction. So I'm standing up, I'm turning, I'm contorting to get that pencil to feel natural as I make those hairs. So the right side, much easier. It probably took me half the time with the right side of the face. I always draw the whiskers last because you'll see whiskers span basically the entire width of the paper. You know, they're covering the face, the chest, the paws. In this case, they're covering the shelf. You know, you basically have one shot to get that white stroke to go the way you want it to. Very tricky, very tricky. What I like to do, you guys, sometimes is I'll be sitting with these cats on my lap during the day and I will just study their faces. And what I'm looking for is to see the direction that those hairs lay across the face, particularly in their nose, the bridge area, around their eyes. They've got such interesting features, and the way those hairs lay, the directions they're oriented, and even the length of a lot of their hairs is very informative. I like to think of it as field study. It really helps. It really helps. So get those cats in your arms and use them for your research. Lapse. You may notice that that left side of the shelf was cut off in the original photo. And so I didn't want to play any guessing games and fill that in based on what I thought it would look like, because it's kind of a unique piece, as you can see. So I actually requested from the woman who commissioned this to send me additional photos of the shelf, and she happily did so, and I'm very grateful because I was able to see what it actually looked like. And so you're looking at the portrait and you're not thinking, something's a little off with that shelf, you know, like everything else looks pretty good, but that shelf, no, you want it to look the way it does. So, little tip, don't be afraid to ask for additional photos. Alright, so I think that basically covers all of the touch points I wanted to address with this portrait. Again, if you have any questions about drawing a cat, a dog, any animal, any subject, and pastel in particular, you know, I am an open book. Please feel free to reach out to me on any of my social channels and subscribe for more weekly videos from Brittany Tangen Fine Art. Until next time, you guys have an excellent week ahead, and I will see you soon. Mwah.